Now, for more on the Republic of Korea's economy, I'm joined by Robert Kelly. He's an associate professor of international relations at Pusan National University. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Now, looking at South Korea's economic picture overall, how would you describe its economic performance the second quarter?
Actually, not bad. I think there's a lot of sort of unnecessary gloom and doom in South Korea. I think in part this is because South Korea used to be one of these Asian tiger states that grew at like 4, 5, 6% and stuff like that. And I think South Koreans are sort of coming to grips with the fact that their country is becoming increasingly normal. That is to say that, modern OECD economies, mature economies grow at only like 2 or 3%, which is around where Korea is. But Korea didn't go through, for example, like a major rupture when the Great Recession hit a couple of years ago. 5 or 8 years back. Korea didn't have any big bank collapses or massive unemployment failures or something like that. So Korea actually grows reasonably well. I'm actually relatively optimistic about it.
So what do you consider some of the bright spots in South Korea?
I think the government has begun to emphasize, and this is important, that South Korea needs to really shift away from manufacturing and towards services and information. South Korea's biggest structural challenge in the next 20 years is that its heavy focus on manufacture means that it's competing against rising challengers like China and Southeast Asia and not against the countries ahead of it like Japan and the United States pulling away into services and information. That's what really needs to shift. I also think South Korea's got a very highly educated labor force that will work ridiculously long hours, so it's actually a really good place to invest because you can actually keep people at work, which you really shouldn't be able to do, but you can actually keep your workforce in the office for very long periods of time, much longer than in the West.
Now, we know that younger voters were really hoping for a brighter employment picture with the election of Moon Jae-in. What sort of changes or trends are you seeing on that front?
Yeah, I think the big picture for sort of youth unemployment is sort of like breaking up the insider-outsider sort of phenomenon, right? Sort of dual market phenomenon you have in Korea in which insiders, those with jobs, right, sort of are able to construct through unionization and all kinds of sort of other government programs and stuff like that, all kinds of sinecures that are really hard to penetrate, right? So you have sort of like a privileged insider class, civil servants and people in unions and things like that, and then sort of outsiders who are struggling to break into this fairly closed economy. And what that means is that you're just going to have more hire and fire regulations. Now, the left has traditionally been opposed to that. South Korean president is from the left, but I think this is sort of widely understood that it needs to be easier for Korean employers to sort of move employees in and out, and sort of some of these privileges need to be reduced so that you have more churn, especially at the bottom.
Now, being that Moon Jae-in has only been in power for a few months now, how much progress has he made on some of the economic reforms that he ran his campaign on?
Yeah, I don't think a great deal. I mean, he's certainly been more stylistically in tone. He's been, I think, a great improvement on his predecessor. He goes to like old age homes, and he goes and he looks at sort of like environmental projects, and he goes to see like school children and stuff like that. I mean, he's really made an effort to look like he has like this sort of social element to his presidency, which his predecessor just abjured completely. But I think his presidency has really been hijacked by the North Korea thing, to be honest. THAAD, the missile defense debate, has sort of really accelerated. Right, Donald Trump's comments have put North Korea on the front page and stuff like that. And so I think national security has just simply overwhelmed him the last 6 months.
And speaking of that, as we do look at the geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and the DPRK, how is all this affecting South Korea's economy and its potential for investment?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's one of the biggest concerns a lot of South Koreans have about these things. Is not that North Korea is actually going to sort of start a war. North Korea would lose that war. The North Koreans know this. The North Koreans are not going to sort of unilaterally, offensively launch a missile at the United States or South Korea. It would only be part of a much larger sort of imbroglio between everyone. Right. I think the real issue isn't that some kind of surprise war. It's that what does this do for the investment climate? Does this deter foreign investors, bankers, and stuff like that? And then since Donald Trump made his comments yesterday, I've sort of gotten all kinds of email and stuff like that and consultations about this and what does this mean? Is there going to be a conflict? That's what I think the South Koreans worry about. They don't actually worry that the North Koreans are going to suddenly invade.
Now, for the countries that do have a strong trade relationship with South Korea, for example, especially China, what's your outlook for that dynamic?
Yeah, the biggest problem between the Chinese and the South Koreans is not an economic one. I would argue it's a political one. The South Koreans and the Chinese in the last 2 or 3 years have really had a deep falling out, much deeper, I think, than many people expected would happen, over missile defense. South Korea has been installing what's called THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System in South Korea to protect against North Korean missiles. The Chinese have really, really opposed this, right? And they've used all kinds of economic means in order to push the South Koreans to withdraw that system. And this has included sort of punishing South Korean actors and singers who would go to China, restricting Korean products and imports into China, things like that. And this has made it, this has actually turned sort of THAAD, missile defense, from a kind of technical issue to a big governmental issue So the economic issues, though, are fairly straightforward, right? I mean, the two import and export a great deal from each other. They're very high up on each other's most traded with states and stuff like that. So the economic relationship is thick. It's really political. That's the problem.
So is there anything you think needs to happen to really get South Korea's economy on a stronger growth track going forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I would argue that the single biggest problem Korea faces going forward, so like structurally, like in the next 10 to 20 years, besides the sort of shift to services information we mentioned before, right? Korea needs to be more open to that, right? Is people. Korea's demography is getting close to the point where it's actually going to begin to contract. Absolutely. South Korea basically needs immigrants, and it's going to need a lot of them, actually. Or it's going to go the way of Japan, where it's going to have a median age of a population at something like 45, 50. You're going to have, something like 20% of the population over 65. And this is where South Korea is going. That's where Japan is now. Japan is now contracting by something like 150,000 people a year. South Korea could be at that point, too. So if South Korea wants to recover economic dynamism, you're not going to get it by pretending you can get back to the 1960s and 70s. You've got to put sort of new blood into the system, and you have to open up these new industries, services, and information. You can't just make the Korean economy be about ships and cars anymore.
Certainly things have changed. Thank you so much, Robert Kelly, Associate Professor of International Relations at Pusan National University.